right-sided dice. Greetings from across the internet. I'm Rich Mayo, and this is Mach 1 Games. I come to you today beamed through photons and waveforms to bring you a story of scale and proportion. I will take the measure of miniatures and terrain, and I will show you something and hopefully teach you something about how and why, through a series of errors and changes, we have arrived at our current state of congestion. Why do we feel trapped on our terrain, like there is never enough room to move? What hidden hand has cast distance distortion, and why, like a throwback to a spell from an earlier edition, our troubles begin in a past that few remember? Now, if you're anything like me, and you love little miniature worlds and deck out your gaming table like it was the Griswold family Christmas, you have old miniatures, new miniatures, painted miniatures, plastic miniatures, primed miniatures, and even a few chipped and broken miniatures. You probably even have some 3D printed miniatures from Hero Forge. These are not just little women and men. They are heroes and legends of the exploits that you have shared with your friends for the past many years. 2 for me. Over the years, I've acquired terrain, glorious set pieces from Zitterdees, Tabletop World, Dwarven Forge, many of the expansion sets, and Gary's sets too. Yes, that Gary. So in spite of owning a doll collection that could buy a small car, there are some truths that we must come to together. First, my 8-year-old granddaughter likes to play with my little houses, and I encourage her to do so. My cat will roll dice and eat foam rocks, moss trees, and break open those tasty little terrain pieces to see if there are any little mice living in those little mouse-sized houses. Rule 1. Don't take your toys so seriously. Second, up until the early 90s, miniatures were made of a mixture of lead, tin, and trace amounts of antimony, an alloy usually just called white metal. Let's skip over tin. I mean, it hasn't done anything for us since something called the Bronze Age, and talk about the metal that gives the name to indoor plumbing. Plumbus, or lead, is a soft and malleable material. It is also highly toxic. Rule number 2, take your lead miniatures seriously. If you have old miniatures, keep them painted and out of reach from our aforementioned cats and kitties. Okay? Finally, I'm going to come to the point of the video. The scale of your terrain and the scale of your miniatures is different. And your figures take up way too much space so that they unnecessarily crowd your quarters and quarter your spaces. But in spite of the mathematical challenges with size of miniatures, the problems with many battles in RPGs is gridlock. Gridlock. How? Why? No, you're wrong. I read it on the package. They're the same. Well, no, they aren't. Let me tell a story. Years ago, a young priest came to a conservative Christian church to serve as their new pastor or minister or preacher. He asked the congregation, the people who come to Sunday services, how they liked the services to be run. With unanimous accord, they all told him that they liked traditional services. You know, out of the old prayer book with all the old hymns and all of the old rituals, rites, and observances. So he complied, studied those old books, and that Sunday delivered the most straight as an arrow traditional service from the 1935 Book of Common Prayer. The people gathered for after-church fellowship and gave the priest praise for the service, with one tiny reservation. They all missed the ringing of the communion chalice. The young priest accepted this critique and went looking for this lost and obscure ritual. He studied for days, and after not finding it in any of the liturgies, he visited the old priest, retired and living in a quaint cottage by the lake. "Ringing of the chalice," she said with a smile, letting the heat from the tea form mist at the bottom of her thick glasses. And after a pause, "I have a limp." The young priest shuffled in his seat and hung in the silence, waiting for his elder to continue. When it became apparent that she was basking in his disquietude, he searched for inspiration, some clue to decode the cryptic sentiment. But none came. "You have a limp," he repeated, leaning forward and setting down her tea, "that causes me to shuffle when I walk. It builds up a static charge in the metal chalice that would shock people who I touch with it. So I would ground the chalice by touching it on the metal rail, which would cause it to ring," the young priest added triumphantly, eager to redeem his esteem. See, there is a history to things. Choices and conventions that you take for granted at your gaming table are echoes of other things, other people, and other games in the past. So when game designers work through a new edition of an old game, they keep things around that worked for people, that people liked, like the ringing of the chalice, even if they don't know or remember what its original purpose was. And over time, things get warped and lose their connection back to a common imaginary world. This piece of acrylic resin measures 4 inches by 4 inches and is marked with 16 1-inch squares. So 1 inch is approximately 25.4 millimeters. So when I slap down an old Ral Partha miniature, and where did she go? There we go. So when I slap down an old Ral Partha 25 millimeter miniature on this space, you may think that I've reached the end of the story. The terrain has a 1:60 ratio, and the miniature, more or less, has a 1:60 ratio. Case closed. Well, not so fast, young priest. 25 millimeters in this context actually refers to the height of the figure to its eye line. So if my miniature is 25 millimeters to its eye, a 1-inch miniature in this scale would be about 5 feet 9 inches tall. Now, because casting fine detail is difficult, and you'll note that hands and feet of miniatures are often too big to be proportional. So companies like Ral Partha, who made this miniature, and Grenadier started making models in the 25 to 28 millimeter range, which is somewhere between a 1:76 ratio and our aforementioned 1:60. Just to have a bit of wiggle room on proportions. But proportion wasn't the only problems with these miniatures. Take a look at the size of the base. You can see that these miniatures did not have standard bases. I can do this all day long. Plot miniatures into my grid. You can see, I don't swear that these are all Ral Parthas. I think that's Guthrie. What was her name? She was an excellent miniature modeler. And she did a bunch of those. But you can see pretty clearly, I'm squeezing a lot of these onto a single square. So these companies and others began experimenting with proportion, lead content, plastic content, durability, paintability, the ability to hold detail, and the size of the base so that they would stand up at the table. Not all companies kept the same scales, and not all companies measured to the eyes. See, you can pass off a 20 millimeter or 23 millimeter figure as a 25 millimeter miniature if you measure to the top of the head, or just say, well, they're a little bit short. You see, old wargame miniatures came in a variety of scales, with 15 millimeter, 20 millimeter, and 23 millimeter being the most popular. The most popular scale for wargaming terrain is the scale 1 to 72, which for you railroad aficionados is the HO or OO scale. That is the 20 millimeter scale, smack dab in the middle of the average wargaming range. Not surprising that when a company makes a product, they make it to have the widest possible audience. Excuse me, terrain pieces that were HO scale can be marketed to role-playing gamers, model railroaders, and wargamers alike. The late 70s to early 80s had no standards for miniatures. Let me prove it to you. I'm going to quote from Chainmail, the game considered by many to be the precursor to Dungeons & Dragons, a game created by Jeff Perrin and Gary Gygax. Yes, that Gary. Your troops can be any scale that you desire. The playing area that the battles are fought on should be put on the table rather than the floor. It can be from a minimum of 4 feet to a maximum of 7 feet wide, and it should be at least 8 feet in length. That's it. That's all they had to say about scale in the early wargamings. Movement on the battlefield was then resolved by each type of unit having a movement value from 6 to 24. There was no defined grid. Have had miniatures, I guess to use the past perfect, I have had miniatures for decades. Lots of us old gamers did. But the plurality of role players didn't use them for much more than displaying a marching order. A term that drips with its wargaming ancestry. Theater of the mind was the most common method of play during early Dungeons & Dragons. We had miniature because they were cool, but we didn't use them the same way that they've come to be used from 3rd edition forward. I smiled with glee when I taught my players 3rd edition. And they kept moving their miniatures to the edges, backs, and fronts of the spaces to hug walls, peek around corner, and block escape routes. Using a miniature as an aid for describing your character's actions and position is different and distinct from using it as a representative token for what space you occupy on a board or on a grid. More about that later. But as you see, two worlds will soon collide. And rather than finding some universal synergy, some grand bargain or harmonic unity, it damn near destroys both. Now, this is a modern miniature. And you'll come to see that this modern miniature has a 1-inch base. Now, the 1-inch base stands up and survives. You'll slide, but it stands up very well. Now, this is a cheapo plastic miniature. And here's a slightly nicer one. I love these. This is a little bit bigger than 1 inch, probably made for 1 inch hexes, because these are the confrontation age of Ragnarok, and you can see that they articulate. I told you I like playing with dolls, right? So in this case here, we can see that if I were to fill this square with guards, I would fill 16 units on this 20 by 20 space. Now you've already seen the assumption or the method whereby I can put miniatures of the old style on the board. And you can see pretty quickly that in one way, I'm going to get a very different gaming experience. In fact, my guys keep falling down. Okay? There is a marked difference between this 25 millimeter scale in the back rank and the 32 millimeter scale that's common today. And this change in the size of miniatures is very significant, and it leads to a problem of congestion that I talked about earlier, because I don't sit around looking for things to complain about. I just don't like it when we have a gaming experience that doesn't match the story that we're trying to tell. And if you cannot tell a story about a crowd correctly because one of these guys plonk on a square, you cannot, if you are an enemy, for what that's designed for, because Dungeons and Dragons and this type of rule set treat the grid as sacrosanct. This character, that creature, fills that space. Now, I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, Rich, you're misreading the rules. The rules say that you control a 5-foot space, not that you fill it up completely. It's assumed that you're going to be wielding a sword, and by so wielding a sword, it's going to, you're going to need space to do that, and it's going to occupy that 5-foot space. And there's a great English word for this, and it's called bollocks. I have trained with a lot of swordsmen. I've stood in a 5-foot square, and indulge me. Go take out a can of spray paint and go to your nice kitchen carpet and spray out a 5 by 5 foot area and wonder how many people you can fit in that space. The answer is not 1. It's probably a lot more than 4. You could have 4 people fighting out of that space. So the original concept that came to us from the wargaming thing had a better sense of scale and proportion by making the bases big so that they will stand up correctly in battle. We've now got ourselves a problem that we cannot crowd, which makes every corridor and every interior space on all your terrain seem incredibly small when you start trying to move things around. Everything's blocked. So I've read a bit to you from Chainmail, and a few years later, I want to read something from the Dungeon Master's Guide, which is first edition Dungeons and Dragons, just to give you a context of where things are coming from. So on page 10 of the Dungeon Master's Guide, it talks about the different approaches to playing the game, and it talks about using miniatures for the game. The special figures cast for advanced Dungeons & Dragons add color to play and make refereeing far easier. Each player might be required to furnish painted figures representing his or her player character and all henchmen and or hirelings included in the game session. Such distinctively painted figures enable you to immediately recognize each individual involved. Figures can be placed so as to show their order of march, i.e., which characters are in the lead, which are in the middle, and which are bringing up the rear. Furthermore, players are more readily able to visualize their array and plan actions while seeing the reason for your restriction on their actions. Monster figures are likewise most helpful, as many things become instantly apparent when a party is arrayed and their monster opponents placed. Furnishing such monsters is probably best undertaken as a joint effort, the whole group contributing towards the purchase of such figurines on a regular basis. Be very careful to purchase castings which are scale. Out-of-scale monsters are virtually worthless in many cases. As a rule of thumb, here we get to it, HO scale is 25 millimeters, equals 1 actual inch, equals 6 inch in scale height. They didn't say 5, they said 6 in length or breadth. Figure bases are necessarily broad in order to assure that the figures will stand in a proper position and not constantly be falling over. Because of this, it is necessary to use a ground scale twice that of the actual scale for HO, and squares of about 1 actual inch per side are suggested. Each ground scale inch can therefore be used to equal, wait for it, 3.5 linear feet. So a 10-foot wide scale corridor is actually 3 inches in width and is shown as 3 separate squares. This allows depiction of the typical array of 3 figures abreast, and also enables easily handling of such figures when they are moved. While you may not find it convenient to actually use such figures in floor plans to handle routine dungeon movement, having sheets of squares for certain encounter areas can be quite helpful. 2 man-sized figures per square is quite possible, as the space is actually 6 scale feet with respect to length. Okay, a little bit to unpack there, but the first thing is that this is not some great tome. They don't have everything figured out, because apart from the squares being mentioned prominently in the first part of the book, you're going to see from this point forward that the rest of the rules in Dungeons & Dragons first edition are actually based on a hex. Now, a hex, or a hexagon, is 6 wonderful little equilateral triangles spilled together. And the length across the hex on the long diagonal is twice the length of the sides. Notice how I said long diagonal. There's a short diagonal. The short diagonal is normally the distance that you travel moving from hex to hex, going through a side, moving you from the middle of one hex to the middle of another hex through the sides. You're going across the short diagonal, which is a fraction, a portion of the long diagonal length. So if you had a hex that was 1 inch from center to center, the actual area of that hex is 87% of the area of a 1-inch square. Now understand that the 1-inch square, as we've just read, is suggesting that 1 inch represents 3.5 feet, not 5 feet. So you can see by degrees the fact that in order to translate from hex to square, in earliest editions, Dungeons and Dragons, they recognized the value and importance of scale, and were very clear that they wanted miniatures to the 25 millimeter scale. And if you actually factor in the 87% size loss if you're going with hexes, I would argue that that's approximately 21 millimeters. It's closer to the HO equivalent scale. So you can see how they keep coming back to reality and shade things up or down. Okay, well, if we're moving hexes, we should do it this way because we want the math to work out. And this is the important thing. Always having that to go back to means that you don't compound your errors. You don't start shaving off numbers and percentages, and you don't end up with what we have in 3rd edition. So, and you'll notice the reliance on hexes throughout the rest of the book. The other thing that I will mention is characters. You can see that the rules are based on hexes because a medium character can be attacked by 6 other medium characters, not 8. If we're actually using a squared grid as the default assumption, you'd actually get 8 characters around them. A small creature can be attacked by 6 small creatures. A large creature can be attacked by 6 large creatures. A large creature can be attacked by 8 medium creatures. They scale up. So where I'm going with all of this is that the miniature is used for representing your character in time and space, that there was a certain scale to things. The other thing I'd like to come back to and point out is if you feel congested walking down a hospital corridor, one would think that that's pretty funny. Well, the minimum width of a hospital corridor is less than 5 feet. In D&D 3rd edition rules and forwards, only one character can walk abreast down a hospital corridor. And a hospital corridor is less than 5 feet. Generally, there are hospital corridors that are wider than 5 feet. But don't you find that absurd that we've lost touch with the reality? Now, I've read from 1st edition, I've read from Chainmail. Now I'd like to complete Rich's reading rainbow and read from 3rd edition. Because here we have something coming into the game that I think is very important. First paragraph, chapter 8 on combat. The first paragraph is not how combat works. That's paragraph number 2. The first paragraph is the battle grid. And I told you I'd come back to this. To help visualize events in the fictional world of the D&D game, we recommend the use of miniature figures and a battle grid. A battle grid, such as the one provided in the Dungeon Master's Guide, consists of a grid of 1-inch squares. Each of these squares represents a 5-foot square in the game world. You can use the grid along with miniature figures or some other form of markers or tokens to show the marching order of your adventure party. They can walk abreast down a 10-foot wide dungeon corridor or single file in a 5-foot wide tunnel. And here's how we got here. The scale and proportion of the miniatures has changed significantly. If I were to say that we should recalculate based on the fact that early D&D is really based on a hex-based system, and the 25 millimeter miniature was the assumption for there. When they translated across to a grid, they translated across to a 3 1/3, 3.3, so that you have a 10-foot space represented by 3 squares, which, incidentally, if you look at that, being represented by 3 squares means that your character gets into the middle, and around the outside of your character, you are surrounded by 8 other spaces. If each creature can occupy a space, you sort of have an area around yourself, and that is their suggestion. That might be complicated for you, and if we were to, however, perform the math, 87% of a 25 mil miniature is a 21 millimeter miniature, and most miniatures nowadays are actually made in about a 32 millimeter scale, which means that we have a 2/3 kind of problem. And, well, 2/3 is quite a bit to deal with. So you can take the original AD&D suggestion and make 1 square 3.5, 3.333 feet, so that 3 squares make up a 10-foot. That's not a beyond reasonable assumption. The other thing that you can do is just say that a square is 2.5 feet, which just means that this becomes a 10-foot by 10-foot space, and math becomes a little bit easier, and then you place the character at the intersections to show that they're controlling a space, and your 3rd, 4th, and 5th edition rules then kick in. And you'll find that you have more space to navigate around your battles. So there's no perfect answer in any of these. We've arrived here by a series of accidents and misadventures, and we've arrived here because people just compounded their mistakes. They made a little adjustment here, a little adjustment there, and a little adjustment there. And that's pretty common. I advise people on financial ERP packages for business all the time. And when people get confused by bookkeeping, I always try to bring it back to, well, what's the impact on the bank? A deposit to the bank is a debit transaction. And if you can actually frame it back to a reality, back to a concrete thing that you can pin to and say, okay, well, this is what we're trying to represent. The reason for the miniatures, we want to make things clear. And right now they're doing the exact opposite. They're obfuscating. They're hiding the truth from you. They're congesting your battlefield. They're making things worse. They're making things slower. And you don't understand why, because you're following the rules. And that's the problem. The rules, I don't know. I always get thumbs downs in the comments whenever I complain about Dungeons and Dragons or criticize the game designers. I mean, but you know, if you're stupid, you're stupid, right? You don't know you're stupid. Like, what can I say, right? So if game designers would wake up and stop doing stupid things, maybe I'd stop complaining about it. So yeah, they had teams of people working on this stuff, and they couldn't get it. They couldn't get it right. That's just frustrating. At some point, you got to come back to reality and stop going, it's good enough. And trust me, I see it all the time. All people go, oh, it's good enough, because they failed to create a broad coalition. This is the heart of the matter. There are three types of gamers. Going back to my gamer narrativist simulationist theory. It's not mine. I didn't come up with it. It's a good way of doing things. I like to talk in my three worlds theory: the internal world, the shared spoken world, and the world on the table. But it sort of amounts to the same thing. The gamers ruled the decisions, and I know why, and it's a personality trait thing, that the gamers, the logic driven, it's just a game, I'm going to plot it out, they took over the game, right? They got written out of the rule book, and that's why the game hasn't come together. And we need those people. I'm not against any one of these groups. I want the game to unify for everybody. So that means getting scale right. So that the simulationist, so that the storyteller, so that they can participate too and don't have to hold their nose because it reeks. So let's get this right. My suggestions are, and you can leave some in the comments below, a square equals 2.5 feet, or go old school. Say a square equals 3.3 feet. Doesn't really matter. Problem just becomes in the translation. Or your other option is play with hexes. Play with hexes and make them 1.5 inch hexes. Now, the challenge is, you don't know what I mean when I say 1.5 inch hex. Do I mean 1.5 from center to center? Right? That's the short diagonal. Do I mean 1.5 on the long diagonal? Do I mean an area of 1.5? Each of those is a different sized hex. And I mean, you could go with a 1 inch hex that's 1 inch on a side. Therefore, it's 2 inches across the hex on the long diagonal. It's slightly less than that. And it's got an area of slightly less than 2. That's got plenty of space. There's lots of ways that you can do it, because the thing is, when you're playing with miniatures, your brain can get around it. This stuff doesn't need to be perfect. That's not what I'm saying, right? It just needs to make general sense, and you can make one rounding and still have the semblance of reality. You can make 2 roundings as long as one rounds one way and one rounds the other way. But if they both round the same way, you're starting to put pressure on things. When you say that 28 millimeters is pretty close to 25 millimeters, then you say that 28 millimeters is pretty close to 32 millimeters. Then you say, well, a 5 foot square is pretty close to a 3 1/3 foot square. Well, if you do those 3 things, you've cut the space on the table in half. And now your characters can't move around, and your characters can't crowd, and you can't tell stories about crowd. And doorways are these, they've always been a choke point, but yeah, it just spirals out of control. So what do we do to fix this? Because we need to fix it. I'm not going to throw out thousands and thousands of dollars of terrain. I'm not going to get different miniatures, especially these wonderful cheapo things, you know, Whiz Kids or Wizards of the Coast or Pathfinder. I don't care where they come from, right? I don't care about them being collectible. If bullywug thugs are cheap, give me a bunch of bullywug thugs. I want to represent things on the battle. I want things to be easy, and I want my game to be fun. Now, the problem is I have a reality disconnect. I have gone from a 25 millimeter scale where a character, if we look at this, where a character would fill up the correct proportion, to a scenario where if you lay the miniature down, you realize that he's somehow 10 feet tall, just shy of it. We're not dealing with 25 millimeter miniatures anymore. So, solve the problem. Change how you view these squares. It's as simple as that. Change this diagram, this piece of terrain, from a 20 by 20 space to a 10 by 10 space. Put people on the corners. Now you can use these large miniatures. Here is somebody controlling a 5-foot space. That's what it looks like. Two people side by side controlling 5-foot space. There's a gap in the middle to move through. So, if you interpret your rules exactly as they're written, I can move through somebody's space. Here, here. If they're an ally, that poses no problem. Now, if I want to stop somebody from rushing through, you can have scenarios where your characters can come together to close off gaps. You can shift over. You can shift apart. You now have a lot more tactically interesting game with the same set of rules, the same miniatures, and the same terrain. Now, I hate forcing people to go through anything like a paradigm shift for no reason. But I hope I've made my case that there is a good reason. So, please leave some comments down below. Let me know what you think. Also, please subscribe to both the website, the Facebook page, and the YouTube channel, because over the coming months, we will be doing our first open beta. And our first open beta is exciting because I will be shipping out manuals and resources to gaming groups who are registered, who pass my sniff test, is worth me printing out books and sending them off to them in return for feedback. So if you want to become part of it, we have some really interesting paradigms. Don't get hung up on the scale and space thing. I actually throw it in as an alternate rule. Why? Because I know how intractable some people are about anything. So I make things optional. But please, 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 if you're interested, subscribe, provide feedback. Feedback about anything. Sometimes when the comments come in, it's really good for me to see what you think I'm doing well and what needs improvement. And do you like it when I'm a little bit more freeform, or do you like it when things are more scripted? Anyhow, please stay safe, stay happy, and we'll catch up to you next time. Thanks very much. Have a great day.